The sting of cheap champagne on her silk blouse was nothing compared to the sting of his words. Kimberly Rowe stood frozen as her ex, Blake Carter, held court. His voice a smug drawl that sliced through the gallery's polite chatter. He pointed a dismissive thumb in her direction, a weapon disguised as a joke for his new glittering crowd. "See her," he'd laughed. "Still alone, still chasing dusty old canvases while the rest of us build empires." In that moment, she was just a punchline, a ghost of his past he used to make himself feel bigger. But what Blake didn't know, what no one could have possibly guessed, was that in the shadows of that very room a man who truly did build empires was watching. And he was about to make the forgotten artist the one woman the world could never forget. The opening of the New Horizons exhibit at the prestigious Langley Gallery in downtown Chicago was supposed to be a quiet night for Kimberly Rowe. It was a professional obligation, a chance to observe the contemporary art scene she so often felt disconnected from. Her world was one of patient restoration, of coaxing life back into forgotten masterpieces in her small, turpentine-scented studio. She preferred the silent company of long-dead artists to the piercing, evaluative gazes of the living. She was nursing a glass of sparkling water, trying to melt into the white walls when she heard his laugh. It was a sound she'd spent the last year trying to erase from her memory, a slick, arrogant bark that always preceded a cutting remark. Blake Carter. He stood near the centerpiece sculpture, a chaotic tangle of polished steel. He was taller than she remembered, or maybe it was just the impeccable tailoring of his Tom Ford suit. On his arm was Tiffany Monroe, a woman who looked like she'd been assembled by a committee of luxury brand managers. Her dress was liquid silver. Her diamonds were blinding, and her smile was as manufactured as the art on the walls. Kimberly's heart did a painful, familiar plummet. She tried to turn to slip away into the crowd, but Blake's eyes, cold and sharp as ever, found her. A slow, cruel smile spread across his face. He nudged Tiffany and began to walk towards her. "Kim, my God, is that you?" he boomed, feigning surprise. Every head in their vicinity turned. "I almost didn't recognize you without a smudge of pigment on your cheek." Kimberly forced a tight-lipped smile. "Blake, Tiffany, you both look well." "We do, don't we?" Blake said, squeezing Tiffany's arm. He looked Kimberly up and down, his gaze lingering on her simple but elegant navy dress. A consignment shop find she'd been proud of until this very second. "Still doing the... what is it you call it?" "The art doctor thing. I'm an art restorer, Blake." "You know that," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. Right. Patching up old pictures for dusty old museums." He turned to his small entourage of finance bros and their equally glossy dates who had drifted closer, sensing drama. "Kim here is a purist. She doesn't believe in things like, profit or ambition." The group chuckled politely. Kimberly felt a hot flush creep up her neck. This was Blake's stage, and he was casting her in her old role, the naive, uninspired girlfriend he had so magnanimously outgrown. "Someone has to preserve history, Blake," she countered, a spark of defiance in her tone. He waved a dismissive hand. "History is written by winners, Kim. It's about moving forward, not looking back." He gestured around the gallery. "It's about acquisitions, mergers. Building something, not just maintaining." Then came the final brutal blow. He pulled Tiffany closer, kissing her temple theatrically. "I'm just glad I found someone who understands that. Someone who wants a future, not just a past." He looked directly at Kimberly, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that was loud enough for everyone to hear. "See her," he said to one of his friends, nodding her way. "Still alone. Still chasing dusty old canvases while the rest of us build empires. Some people are just meant to be footnotes in other people's stories, The laughter that followed was quiet, but to Kimberly it was a roar. The air in the room felt thick, suffocating. Her carefully constructed composure shattered. She could see the pity in some eyes, the amusement in others. She mumbled a barely audible, "Excuse me," and turned, pushing her way through the crowd, her vision blurring with unshed tears. She didn't see the man standing in the alcove near the exit. He was leaning against the wall, almost a part of the shadows, a glass of whiskey untouched in his hand. He wasn't looking at the art. He had been watching the entire vicious exchange. His face was impassive, a mask of calm control, but his eyes, a startlingly intense shade of gray, had missed nothing. They followed Kimberly's retreating form, a flicker of something unreadable, disgust, curiosity, perhaps even recognition in their depths. His name was Donovan Adler, and he dealt in empires far grander than Blake Carter could ever comprehend. And he had just found something infinitely more valuable than any piece of art in the room. The week that followed the gallery incident was a blur of misery. Kimberly buried herself in her work, the familiar scent of linseed oil and varnish a comforting balm. She was meticulously restoring a 17th-century Dutch landscape, a piece damaged by a small fire decades ago. The painstaking work of cleaning away soot, of matching pigments, of inpainting tiny cracks in the canvas, was her refuge. Here she had control. Here she could make broken things whole again. Her best friend, Sophie Chen, a sharp-witted journalist who had no time for Blake's brand of toxicity, had tried to rally her spirits. "Forget that pompous gasbag Kim," she'd said over a long phone call. "He's a cheap suit with an inflated ego. His entire personality is a pyramid scheme." Kimberly had laughed weakly. "I know. It hurt to be so publicly dismissed. His opinion is worth less than a politician's promise," Sophie had insisted. "Your work is important. It's beautiful. You are not a footnote." Despite Sophie's fierce loyalty, the word footnote had taken root, a poisonous weed in the garden of her self-worth. Was that all she was? A quiet background character in a world that celebrated noise and ruthless ambition. It was on a rainy Thursday afternoon that the email arrived. The subject line was simply "Private Commission Inquiry." The sender's name was unfamiliar. A. Pierce, office of Mr. D. Adler. Kimberly almost deleted it, assuming it was spam, but something made her pause. The email was brief, formal, and devoid of the usual flowery language of potential clients. "Miss Rowe, my employer, Mr. Donovan Adler, has a private restoration project of a highly sensitive and valuable nature he would like to discuss with you. Your profile and past work with Baroque-era portraiture have been noted. An NDA will be required prior to any substantive discussion. A car will be sent to your studio tomorrow at 10:00 a.m. to bring you to a preliminary meeting should you be available. Please confirm your availability. Regards, Arthur Pierce, Chief of Staff, Adler Enterprises." Kimberly stared at the name. Donovan Adler. The name wasn't just known. It was a force of nature, a titan of the tech industry who had appeared seemingly from nowhere a decade ago and revolutionized data security and AI integration. He was notoriously reclusive, a modern-day Howard Hughes, who rarely gave interviews and was almost never photographed. His company, Adler Enterprises, had its tendrils in everything from aerospace to biotechnology. He was a genuine billionaire, not a flashy real estate mogul or a loudmouth stock trader like Blake, but a silent, formidable power. What could a man like that possibly want with her? Her studio was a converted loft in a gentrifying but still gritty neighborhood. Her clients were mostly small museums and private collectors with modest budgets. This was out of her league. It had to be a mistake. She Googled him, of course. The few photos that existed were grainy, taken from a distance at some economic forum years ago. He had dark hair, a strong jaw, and an aura of intense privacy. Articles described him as a genius, a visionary, and utterly unreachable. There was no mention of any interest in art. Her first instinct was fear. This was too big, too strange. But then Blake's mocking voice echoed in her mind, chasing dusty old canvases. Footnote. A surge of defiance, cold and clear, washed over her. She typed her reply, her fingers moving with a newfound sense of purpose. "Mr. Pierce, I am available. I will be ready at 10:00 a.m. Sincerely, Kimberly Rowe. The next morning, at precisely 10:00 a.m., a sleek black Audi A8 so clean it seemed to repel the city grime pulled up outside her building. The driver, a man in a crisp suit, opened the door for her without a word. The interior smelled of rich leather and quiet efficiency. As the car glided silently through Chicago's traffic, Kimberly felt like she had stepped into another dimension. They drove north, leaving the city behind, eventually turning onto a long private road flanked by a dense forest. After several minutes, a breathtaking structure came into view. It wasn't an ostentatious mansion, but a marvel of modern architecture. A sprawling home of glass, dark steel, and warm cedar that seemed to grow out of the cliffside overlooking the vast churning expanse of Lake Michigan. A tall, severe-looking man in his late 50s with silver hair and a perfectly tailored suit met her at the door. "Miss Rowe, I'm Arthur Pierce. Thank you for coming." His handshake was firm and brief. He led her through cavernous minimalist rooms filled not with clutter, but with spacelight and a few carefully chosen pieces of art that made her breath catch. A Rothko here, a de Kooning there. Each one was a museum-quality masterpiece. Finally they entered a large, sun-drenched library. Books lined the walls from floor to ceiling, but one wall was dominated by a single large object covered by a velvet cloth. And standing before it, his back to them, was a man. He was tall and lean-dressed in simple dark trousers and a gray cashmere sweater. He turned as they entered. It was the man from the gallery. Kimberly's heart stopped for a beat. She recognized him instantly, the watcher in the shadows, the intense gray eyes that had seen her humiliation. He offered a small, almost imperceptible nod. "Miss Rowe, Donovan Adler, thank you for making the time." His voice was deeper than she'd expected, a calm baritone that held a quiet authority. "Mr. Adler," she managed, her voice a little shaky. "The pleasure is mine. I'll be blunt," he said, skipping any pleasantries. "I have a project for you, one that requires absolute discretion and, more importantly, a delicate hand." He walked to the covered object and with a smooth motion pulled away the velvet cloth. Kimberly gasped. On the easel was a portrait, a stunning piece clearly from the late Baroque period. It depicted a woman with fiery red hair and eyes the color of a stormy sea. Her expression was one of defiant sorrow, her beauty tinged with a deep, tragic wisdom. But the painting was terribly damaged. A long, jagged tear ran diagonally from the top right corner down to the center, and the lower left quadrant was marred by severe water damage. The paint blistered and faded. "My great-great-grandmother, Lenora Adler," Donovan said softly, his gaze fixed on the portrait. "It's the only one ever painted. It was damaged during a fire at my family's ancestral home in Germany nearly 80 years ago. It was thought to be lost. I only recently reacquired it." Kimberly stepped closer, her professional instincts taking over. She saw past the damage to the masterful brushwork beneath the incredible detail in the lace collar, the life in the woman's eyes. "It's magnificent," she breathed. "The style is reminiscent of Van Dyck, but the emotional intensity is different." "You see it," he said, a note of approval in his voice. "Most experts I've consulted only saw the damage. They saw the cost. You see the soul." He turned his full attention to her, his gray eyes searching her face. "I was at the Langley Gallery the other night. I saw what happened." Kimberly flinched, the shame washing over her again. What that man Blake Carter said was contemptible. Donovan stated, his voice flat and cold. "But what I observed was not a footnote. I saw a woman of immense passion and skill being belittled by a man of immense ego and little substance. His opinion is irrelevant. Your work, however, is not." He gestured back to the painting. "This painting is the last link to a part of my family I know very little about. Restoring it is more than just a job. It's about reclaiming a piece of my own history." His gaze met hers again, and it was intense, unwavering. "I believe you are the only person who can do it. Will you help me, Miss Rowe?" In that moment, standing in the quiet sunlit library of a man who owned the world, Kimberly felt a profound shift. This wasn't just a job offer. It was an anointing, a validation that came from the most unexpected of sources. It was a chance to prove, if only to herself, that she was not a footnote. She was the one who could restore the past, and in doing so, perhaps begin to build her own future. "Yes, Mr. Adler," she said, her voice clear and strong. "I will." The Adler estate became Kimberly's second home. A wing of the house overlooking a serene Japanese garden was converted into a state-of-the-art restoration studio for her. It was a world away from her dusty loft. Here she had access to the best equipment imaginable: a digital X-ray fluorescence spectrometer to analyze pigments, a climate-controlled chamber for stabilizing the canvas, and a collection of rare vintage pigments that Donovan's staff had sourced from around the globe. But the true heart of the project was not in the technology. It was in the quiet hours spent with the painting of Lenora Adler. And unexpectedly with Donovan himself. He was not an overbearing client. He would often enter the studio silently, standing for long stretches, simply watching her work. He'd bring her coffee in a plain white mug, sitting in a leather armchair he'd had moved into the corner, reading a dense-looking book on quantum physics or ancient history. At first their conversations were stilted, focused entirely on the restoration. She would explain the delicate process of removing the old yellowed varnish or the chemical composition of a 17th-century binder. He would listen with an unnerving focus, asking intelligent, insightful questions that revealed a deep intellectual curiosity. But slowly, the subject matter began to drift. "Her eyes," he said one afternoon, his gaze on the portrait, "they look trapped." Kimberly was painstakingly in-painting a tiny section of Lenora's cheek, her brush steady. "She was a woman of her time," she murmured. "Beautiful, valuable, and likely owned. First by her father, then by her husband. Her defiance probably had very little room to breathe." Donovan was quiet for a long moment. "My family owes its initial fortune to her," he said, his voice low. "Her dowry. It was vast. But the family histories barely mention her beyond that. She is treated like a financial transaction." This was the first time he'd spoken of his family with anything other than factual detachment. Kimberly found herself wanting to know more. "Maybe that's why she looks like that," she offered. She knew her worth was more than just monetary, but no one else did. A flicker of something anger crossed his face before his usual stoic mask slipped back into place. Perhaps. As weeks turned into a month, the portrait of Lenora began to transform under Kimberly's skilled hands. The jagged tear was meticulously mended, the canvas relined. The water damage was slowly, painstakingly reversed. Lenora's face, once obscured by grime and tragedy, was emerging vibrant and alive. And as the painting healed, something else was healing too. The wound Blake had inflicted began to feel less like a gaping chasm and more like a distant scar. Kimberly found her confidence returning, not in a loud, aggressive way, but in a quiet, solid assurance rooted in her own skill. One evening, working late, she was struggling to perfectly match the deep crimson of Lenora's velvet dress. Frustrated, she sighed and set her brush down. "A difficult color," Donovan's voice came from the doorway. She hadn't heard him enter. "The most difficult," she admitted, rubbing her tired eyes. "It's cochineal mixed with a madder lake glaze. The iridescence is almost impossible to replicate." He walked over, standing beside her, their shoulders almost touching as they looked at the canvas. The faint, clean scent of his cologne sandalwood and something else she couldn't place mingled with the smell of oils and solvents. "My mother was a painter," he said suddenly. The confession hung in the air, unexpected and deeply personal. Not professionally, it was just for her. She said that red was the color of secrets, of passion and pain all mixed together. Kimberly turned to look at him. In the soft light of the studio lamps, the guarded planes of his face seemed softer. "What happened to her?" she asked gently. His jaw tightened. She passed away when I was 16. A car accident. He looked away back at the painting. She was the one who taught me to appreciate things that last. Things with history. Everything else is just noise. Kimberly felt a powerful wave of empathy. She finally understood his reclusiveness, his quiet intensity, his disdain for the superficial world of people like Blake. He was a man who had lost his anchor early and had spent his life building impenetrable walls to protect what was left. "I'm so sorry, Donovan," she said, using his first name for the first time. He met her gaze, and the wall was gone. For a split second she saw the 16-year-old boy lost and alone. "Thank you," he said simply. The moment was broken by the discreet chime of his phone. He glanced at it, and a frown creased his brow. "There's a charity gala next Friday. The Children's Literacy Fund. I'm a primary benefactor. I'm expected to make an appearance." He sounded as if he were describing a root canal. "You don't enjoy them," she stated, a small smile playing on her lips. "I loathe them," he corrected. "A room full of people who want something from me pretending they don't." He paused, looking at her, a strange calculating light in his eyes. "However, my attendance this year is non-negotiable." He hesitated for a fraction of a second. "I would be grateful if you would accompany me." Kimberly was stunned. "Me? But I don't have anything to wear. I don't belong in that world." "I can arrange for something for you to wear," he said, dismissing her first concern. Then his voice softened. "And as for the second part, you belong wherever you choose to be. Your presence would make the evening significantly more tolerable for me." She thought of the Langley Gallery, of the whispers and the pitying looks. The idea of walking into a room like that again sent a spike of fear through her. But the thought of walking in on Donovan Adler's arm, that was different. It wasn't about revenge. It was about standing next to a man who saw her, truly saw her, and finding the courage to see herself in the same light. "Okay," she said, a surprising thrill running through her. "I'll go with you." A genuine, startlingly attractive smile touched Donovan's lips for the first time. "Excellent," he said. "Mr. Pierce will handle all the arrangements." He didn't know it, and neither did she, but this was more than just a date. It was a strategic move. Donovan Adler never did anything without a reason. And he had a very specific reason for wanting Kimberly Rowe by his side at the most public high society event of the year. The days leading up to the gala were a whirlwind. A stylist, a quiet woman named Helene with an impeccable eye, arrived at the estate with racks of designer gowns. Kimberly, who was used to thrift stores and sensible work clothes, felt like an imposter playing dress-up. She finally settled on a deep emerald green gown by a designer she'd never heard of, a classic silhouette that clung to her curves in a way that was both elegant and powerful. The night of the gala, as she descended the grand staircase of the Adler mansion, she saw Donovan waiting at the bottom. He was in a perfectly tailored Brioni tuxedo, a Patek Philippe watch gleaming on his wrist. But it wasn't his attire that made her breath catch. It was the look in his eyes. He watched her every step, his usual stoic expression replaced by one of open, unguarded admiration. "Kimberly," he said, his voice a low murmur, "you look transcendent." "You clean up pretty well yourself, Mr. Adler," she replied, a blush rising on her cheeks. "Donovan," he corrected, gently offering his arm. "Tonight, it's Donovan." The gala was being held at the Chicago Symphony Center, the grand ballroom glittering with crystal chandeliers and overflowing with the city's elite. The moment they stepped out of the car, flashbulbs erupted. The press, usually kept at a far distance from the reclusive billionaire, went into a frenzy. "Mr. Adler, who is your companion?" "Donovan, a word for the Chronicle." Donovan ignored them all, his hand resting firmly on the small of Kimberly's back, guiding her through the throng with a quiet, unassailable authority. Inside, the noise was of a different kind, a hum of speculation. Heads turned. Whispers followed them like a wake. Kimberly could feel hundreds of eyes on her, dissecting her, questioning her presence. For a moment the old fear returned. But then Donovan leaned in close, his breath warm against her ear. "Just focus on me," he whispered. "Everyone else is irrelevant." And strangely they were. They were making their way to their designated table when a familiar grating voice cut through the air. "Well, well, well, look what the cat dragged in." Kimberly froze. Blake Carter stood before them, a flute of champagne in his hand, a smug smirk plastered on his face. Tiffany was beside him, her silver dress even more ostentatious than the one she'd worn at the gallery. Blake's eyes raked over Kimberly, a flicker of surprise in them before it was replaced by his usual condescension. "Nice dress, Kim. Did you have to restore a whole museum wing to afford that one?" Before Kimberly could respond, Donovan took a half step forward, subtly positioning himself between her and Blake. He didn't say a word. He simply looked at Blake with his cold gray eyes, his expression utterly blank. It was more intimidating than any overt threat. Blake, however, was too arrogant to read the room. He was performing for his audience. "So who's the sugar daddy?" he sneered, gesturing vaguely at Donovan. "You finally decided to take my advice and get ambitious." Tiffany giggled, a shrill, unpleasant sound. "She's certainly aiming high, I'll give her that." The air grew thick with tension. The whispers around them ceased. Everyone was watching. This was the moment Kimberly had been dreading, another public humiliation. She braced herself for the impact of the words, but the blow never came. Donovan Adler finally spoke, his voice not loud but carrying an incredible weight that cut through the silence. "Mr. Carter, is it?" Blake puffed out his chest. "Blake Carter, Senior VP at Sterling Cooper Investments." He said the name as if it were a royal title. Donovan gave a slow, deliberate nod as if memorizing a trivial piece of data. "I see." He then turned his head slightly to look at Kimberly, his expression softening in a way that was visible to everyone. He reached out and gently tucked a stray strand of hair behind her ear, a gesture of profound intimacy in the suffocatingly public space. He then looked back at Blake, his eyes turning to ice. "You seem to be under several misapprehensions," Donovan said, his tone chillingly calm. "First, you will address Miss Rowe with respect. Second, your assessment of her ambition is laughably inadequate." He paused, letting the silence stretch, his gaze sweeping over the rapt audience before landing back on Blake with the force of a physical blow. "Kimberly Rowe is not aiming for anything. She has already achieved it." He took Kimberly's hand, lacing his fingers through hers. He held it up slightly, a silent declaration to the entire room. "You see, Mr. Carter, you dismissed her as a footnote in someone else's story. You were mistaken." His voice dropped, becoming a clear, resonant proclamation that echoed in the silent ballroom. "This woman is not a footnote. She is the title of the most important chapter of my life." He looked directly at Blake, a man he could ruin with a single phone call, and delivered the final devastating line. "So to answer your vulgar question, I am not her sugar daddy. I am the man who will be her husband. She is not my date for the evening. She is my future bride." A collective gasp went through the room. Cameras flashed from the press line that had crept inside. Tiffany Monroe's jaw dropped, her perfectly painted mouth hanging open. Blake Carter's face went from smug to confused to utterly ashen. The blood drained from it, leaving him looking pale and suddenly small in his expensive suit. He had tried to make Kimberly a punchline, but Donovan Adler had just made him a ghost at his own funeral. Kimberly stared at Donovan, her heart hammering against her ribs. Bride-husband. Was this real? Was it a strategic ploy to protect her? She couldn't be sure, but as she looked into his steady, sincere gray eyes, she saw no deception. She saw only a fierce, unwavering conviction. In that moment, in front of the entire Chicago elite, Blake Carter was erased. And Kimberly Rowe, the quiet art restorer, was reborn. The fallout was immediate and explosive. By the time they left the gala, Donovan steering a shell-shocked Kimberly through a ravenous sea of reporters, the news was already breaking online. Tech titan Donovan Adler announces shock engagement to mystery woman, who is Kimberly Rowe, the art restorer who captured the world's most elusive billionaire. Sophie Chen's phone had started buzzing with calls from editors before Donovan's car had even reached the gates of the estate. She called Kimberly, her voice a mix of shock and elation. "Kim, what in the name of all that is holy just happened? My phone is melting. Did he really?" Bride. "Is this for real? I don't know." Soph. Kimberly had whispered, sinking into the plush leather of the Audi, acutely aware of Donovan sitting silently beside her. It all happened so fast. The ride back to the mansion was silent, but it was a heavy, charged silence. Kimberly's mind was racing. Husband, bride. The words ricocheted in her head. It had been a performance, a masterful checkmate in a social chess game she hadn't even known she was playing. But was it only that? The way he had looked at her, the feel of his hand in hers. It had felt real, terrifyingly real. When they arrived, Donovan led her not to the studio or the library, but to a comfortable sitting room with a roaring fireplace. Mr. Pierce appeared with a tray bearing 2 glasses and a bottle of what looked like very old scotch. Donovan poured them each a drink and handed one to her. "I owe you an explanation," he said, his voice finally breaking the silence. "And an apology." Kimberly clutched the heavy crystal glass. "An apology for what?" "For defending me, for saving me, for putting you on a stage without your permission," he countered, his gaze intense. "I used you, Kimberly. I used my intentions for you as a weapon against him. It was effective, but it was not fair to you." She took a sip of the scotch. It was smoky and smooth, warming her from the inside out. "Your intentions?" she asked softly. He took a step closer. "My proclamation was premature, but it was not false." He looked into the fire, his profile etched by the flickering light. "I have spent the last 10 years of my life building Adler Enterprises. It has been my sole focus. I built walls, moats, firewalls, both digital and personal. I let very few people in. I believed connection was a liability." He turned back to her, his gray eyes searching hers. "And then I saw you. First in your work online, the passion, the precision. Then at that gallery, I saw your grace under fire from that insignificant man. And for the past month I have watched you breathe life back into a piece of my family's soul. You are patient and brilliant and kind. You are everything my world is not." He set his glass down. "When he attacked you tonight, I reacted. It was a strategic decision, yes, but it was fueled by something else. A desire to protect you that was overwhelming. And a sudden stark realization that the thought of my future without you in it is no longer acceptable to me." Kimberly was speechless. Her entire world had tilted on its axis. A man who spoke in algorithms and acquisitions was now speaking the language of the heart, however formally. "Donovan, You don't have to say anything," he said quickly. "I am not asking you to marry me tonight. I am telling you that is my goal. I am laying my cards on the table. The world now knows my position. The only thing that matters, the only thing that has ever mattered, is what you decide your position will be. We can continue as we are. You can finish the painting and walk away. Or we can see where this leads." Meanwhile, across town, Blake Carter's world was imploding. His phone was vibrating with messages from his boss, from his colleagues, from his parents. Sterling Cooper Investments did business with 2 subsidiaries of Adler Enterprises. The name Donovan Adler was one his CEO spoke with a reverence usually reserved for deities. Tiffany Monroe was staring at him, her face a mask of fury. His bride. His bride. "You told me she was a nobody. A pathetic little artist you dumped? She is... I don't know what this is, some kind of publicity stunt?" Blake stammered, pacing his sterile, overpriced condo. "A publicity stunt!" Tiffany shrieked, grabbing her purse. "Blake, That man could buy this entire city block with the interest he earns in an hour. He doesn't need stunts. You just picked a fight with a god and you tried to use me as your shield. We're done." She stormed out, slamming the door behind her. Blake sank onto his beige sofa, the smugness he wore like armor completely gone. He had built his entire identity on being on the winning team, on associating with power. Tonight he had publicly mocked the future wife of one of the most powerful men on the planet. He wasn't just a footnote anymore. He was a cautionary tale. Back at the Adler estate, Kimberly looked at the man standing before her. He was offering her a world she couldn't imagine, but more than that, he was offering her his truth. He had seen her at her most humiliated, and had not seen weakness, but strength. He didn't want to change her. He wanted to champion her. The fear was still there, a tiny tremor in her soul, but it was being eclipsed by a stronger, brighter feeling. Hope. "I don't know what to say," she said honestly. "Then say nothing," Donovan replied, his voice gentle. "For now, let's just enjoy the quiet." He was giving her space. He was giving her a choice. After a year of feeling like her choices had been taken from her, it was the most valuable gift he could have offered. She didn't know if she was ready to be a billionaire's bride, but she knew with a certainty that settled deep in her bones that she wanted to know the man who was willing to be her champion. The chapter was just beginning. The media frenzy did not die down. If anything, it intensified. Kimberly Rowe became an object of international fascination. Paparazzi camped out at the end of Donovan's private road. Tabloids offered staggering sums for any details about her past. Every old classmate, every former colleague, every distant relative was a potential source. Donovan's security team, led by the ever-efficient Mr. Pierce, formed an impenetrable shield around her. Her life became a strange paradox. She was one of the most famous women in the world. Yet her day-to-day existence was quieter than ever, confined to the beautiful gilded cage of the Adler estate. She threw herself into the final delicate stages of restoring Lenora's portrait. The work grounded her, reminded her of who she was before all of this. Her relationship with Donovan deepened in the quiet moments between the media storms. They ate dinners together, walked through the sprawling gardens, and talked for hours about art, technology, philosophy, and the strange new reality of their lives. He was brilliant, funny in a dry, understated way, and fiercely protective. Kimberly found herself falling for him, not for the billionaire, but for the man who read quantum physics in his spare time and knew how to make her a perfect cup of tea. But while their future was blooming, Blake Carter's was rotting from the roots. He was a pariah. He was called into a meeting with the board of Sterling Cooper Investments and unceremoniously fired. The official reason was conduct unbecoming of a senior officer, but the subtext was clear: you don't insult Donovan Adler's fiancée. He was ostracized from his social circle, his calls going unanswered. He had built his world on the shifting sands of status, and now the tide had gone out, leaving him stranded and exposed. His desperation curdled into a venomous obsession. He couldn't accept his downfall. In his twisted logic, it wasn't his fault. It was Kimberly's. She had somehow tricked this billionaire, played the victim, and ruined him. He spent his days and nights scouring the internet, digging into her life, looking for a weakness, a secret he could use to tear her down and reclaim his own standing. And then he found it. He stumbled upon an obscure art blog post from 5 years prior. It was an academic debate about a series of forgeries of Dutch masters that had briefly circulated in the European market. The forger was brilliant, perfectly mimicking the techniques of the era. One of the paintings discussed a landscape attributed to a student of Rustiel had been sold through a small, now defunct gallery in Brussels, where Kimberly had interned for a summer during her studies. It was a flimsy connection, a thread of smoke, but for Blake it was a lifeline. He began to craft a narrative. He reached out to a notorious online gossip columnist known for printing scandalous, often unverified stories, a man named Marco Vance. A week later, the story broke. Billionaire's Bride, a brilliant forger, the dark secret in Kimberly Rowe's past. The article was a masterpiece of insinuation and libel. It painted Kimberly not as a talented restorer, but as a failed artist with the skills of a master forger. It connected her to the Brussels gallery, hinting that her internship was a cover for learning the criminal side of the art world. It suggested that her restoration of the Adler painting was in fact an elaborate forgery, a trick to dupe the reclusive billionaire. Blake was quoted anonymously as a concerned former associate who worried that Adler was being catfished by an art world criminal. The story spread like wildfire. It was exactly the kind of juicy, scandalous twist the public had been craving. Doubt began to creep into the narrative. Was Kimberly Rowe really a Cinderella story, or was she a cunning grifter? When Kimberly saw the article, the world swam before her eyes. The accusation was so vile, so far from the truth, it felt like a physical blow. It attacked the very core of her identity, her skill, her integrity, her passion. All the confidence she had painstakingly rebuilt crumbled. Donovan found her in the studio staring at the nearly completed portrait of Lenora, tears streaming down her face. The vile article was open on her tablet. His face became a thundercloud. He read the article in seconds, his jaw clenching so hard a muscle jumped. "Pierce is already tracing the source," he said, his voice a low growl. "We'll sue them into oblivion." "It doesn't matter," Kimberly whispered, her voice choked with despair. "The poison is out there now. People will always wonder. Blake, he's taken my name from me." She looked from the article to the beautiful restored face of Lenora. "How can you ever trust me now? How can you look at this and not wonder if it's real?" Donovan crossed the room in 2 strides. He took her face in his hands, his touch surprisingly gentle. "Kimberly, look at me." She forced her tear-filled eyes to meet his. "Do I strike you as a man who is easily fooled?" he asked, his voice raw with an intensity that vibrated through her. "I have built an empire on seeing things others miss, on differentiating between the authentic and the fraudulent. I vetted you more thoroughly than my own board of directors before I ever sent that first email." He let go of her face and walked to a large steel safe concealed behind a bookshelf. He spun the dial and opened the heavy door. From it he removed a thick leather-bound journal and a stack of yellowed letters tied with a faded ribbon. He brought them to the work table and laid them down beside her pallet. "This was Lenora's journal," he said softly. "And these are her letters. They were hidden in a false bottom of the crate the painting was shipped in. I've had them since the beginning." He opened the journal. On one page was a detailed charcoal sketch of her own face, a self-portrait. It was unmistakably the woman in the painting. In her letters she wrote with heartbreaking detail about sitting for the portrait, about the artist, about the arguments with her husband. She even described the exact composition of the crimson pigment in her dress, a secret family recipe of the artist's. "I never told you about these," Donovan continued, "because I wanted to see what you would discover on your own. And you found everything. You identified pigments that aren't even on record without any prompting. You spoke of her personality, her defiance, her sorrow as if you knew her. You didn't just restore a canvas, Kimberly. You communed with a soul." He tapped the vile article on the tablet. "This is Noise, written by a desperate, pathetic man." Then he gently touched the journal. "This is Truth. And so," he said, his gaze holding hers, "is this." He gestured between the two of them. "I have never been more certain of anything or anyone in my entire life." Kimberly stared at him, at the proof he laid before her, at the unwavering faith in his eyes. He hadn't just defended her, he had armed her with the truth. Blake's pathetic attempt to poison her name had backfired spectacularly. It had only served to elicit the one secret Donovan had been holding back, the final, irrefutable proof of her talent and her integrity. Blake hadn't just failed to drive them apart, he had bound them together in a way neither of them had expected, with a truth that stretched back centuries. The counteroffensive was swift and devastating. It was not a press release or a denial. It was a full-scale demolition. Donovan Adler did not play defense. First, Adler's legal team, a veritable army of the country's most feared litigators, filed a multi-billion-dollar defamation lawsuit against Marco Vance and the parent company of his gossip site. Faced with financial annihilation, Vance folded within hours, issuing a full retraction and publicly naming Blake Carter as his sole source. Second, Mr. Pierce, using the formidable resources of Adler Enterprises' cybersecurity division, uncovered a trove of Blake's digital communications. They found not only his correspondence with Vance, but also evidence of insider trading and financial misconduct during his last year at Sterling Cooper. This information was neatly packaged and delivered to the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission and the Department of Justice. Blake Carter's reckoning came not with a whisper, but with a bang. Federal agents arrived at his condo at dawn. The man who had mocked Kimberly for being a footnote found himself the subject of front-page headlines for all the wrong reasons. Disgraced financier arrested in fraud probe. His world hadn't just imploded. It had been systematically dismantled and swept away like dust. With the legal and financial battles raging in the background, Donovan orchestrated the final perfect checkmate. He arranged for a private viewing at the Art Institute of Chicago. The guests were not socialites or paparazzi, but the world's most respected art historians, museum curators, and restoration experts. When they entered the climate-controlled gallery, they saw two things displayed side by side. On one side was the magnificent, fully restored portrait of Lenora Adler, her fiery spirit practically glowing on the canvas. On the other, under museum glass, were her journal and letters open to the pages describing the portrait's creation. Kimberly, dressed in a simple, elegant black dress, stood beside the portrait. Donovan stood slightly behind her, a silent, supportive presence. She didn't need him to speak for her. He had given her the stage, and now it was hers. For an hour she spoke. Her voice, once timid, was now filled with a quiet, unshakable authority. She walked the experts through her entire process, showing them X-ray images of the canvas before and after, detailing the chemical analysis of the pigments and explaining the painstaking techniques she'd used to mend the tear. She then connected her scientific findings to the historical proof in Lenora's own words from the journal. It wasn't just a presentation. It was a masterclass. When she finished, the room was silent for a moment, and then it erupted in applause. The director of the Met in New York approached her, his eyes shining with admiration. "Miss Rowe," he said, "this is not just a restoration. It is a resurrection, the most brilliant work I have seen in my career." Her name wasn't just cleared, it was etched into the annals of art history. Offers began pouring in: guest lectureships at Yale, commissions from the Louvre, a fellowship at the Getty. She had become one of the most sought-after experts in her field overnight. Later that evening, they stood alone in the now empty gallery, the portrait of Lenora seeming to watch them with knowing eyes. The chaos was over. The world had been answered. All that was left was the quiet truth between the two of them. "You didn't need to do all of this for me," Kimberly said softly, looking at Donovan. "No," he agreed. "I did it for us." He took her hands in his. They felt warm, strong. "At the gala, I made a public proclamation, a strategic move to protect you. But it was out of order. I should have asked you first." He slowly went down on one knee on the polished marble floor of the Art Institute of Chicago. He didn't produce a comically large diamond ring from his pocket. Instead, he simply looked up at her, his heart in his eyes. "Kimberly Rowe." He began, his voice thick with an emotion she had never heard from him before. "You are the most brilliant, resilient, and passionate person I have ever known. You came into my life to restore a piece of my family's past, but you ended up restoring a part of my future I didn't even know was broken. I don't want to be your champion or your protector. I want to be your partner. I want to build a life with you, one filled with quiet moments, shared passions, and unwavering truth." He finally asked the question, not as a statement to the world, but as a humble plea to her. "Will you marry me?" Tears welled in Kimberly's eyes, but this time they were tears of pure, unadulterated joy. This was real. Not a gambit, not a headline, but a beginning. She was not a damsel in distress being claimed by a billionaire. She was a woman of immense worth being asked to share her life with a man who had seen that worth from the very beginning. "Yes," she whispered, her voice full of love and certainty. "Yes, Donovan. I will." He slid a simple, elegant band onto her finger. It had been his mother's and rose to kiss her. And in the quiet gallery under the watchful gaze of the ancestor who had brought them together, the footnote began writing her own magnificent story. Kimberly's story is a powerful reminder that our worth is never determined by the cruel words or dismissive attitudes of others. It's not defined by the person who left, but by the strength we find in ourselves and the love that finds us when we are most true to who we are. Blake Carter saw her as a footnote because he could only value people based on their utility to him. But Donovan Adler saw the entire beautiful manuscript because he valued substance over spectacle and authenticity over ambition. Her journey wasn't about being saved by a billionaire. It was about being seen by a partner who recognized the empire she had already built within herself, an empire of talent, passion, and integrity. If you were captivated by Kimberly's journey from heartbreak to triumph, please show your support by hitting that like button. Share this video with someone who needs a reminder of their own incredible worth. And for more stories that inspire and empower, make sure you subscribe to our channel and ring that notification bell so you never miss an update. Thank you for listening, and remember, never let anyone else hold the pen that writes your story.
The sound that broke Cressida Bishop's life wasn't a scream, but the delicate shatter of a champagne flute on marble. It was her husband's gala, a celebration of his fashion empire, and she stood frozen 5 months pregnant, watching him kiss another woman under the glare of a crystal chandelier. The woman was his new star designer, but it wasn't the kiss that shattered her. It was his words when he finally saw her. He didn't look guilty, just annoyed. "Darling." He sighed, a whisper of pure venom. "Don't be so dramatic. It's just business. You should focus on your little hobby. You know the baby." Her world didn't just crack. It atomized. That was the night she walked out with nothing but a broken heart and a life growing inside her, completely unaware that the key to his entire kingdom was already in her hands. Life in the Montclair penthouse was an exercise in curated perfection, from the floor-to-ceiling windows that framed the city skyline like a living masterpiece to the stark white orchids that were replaced every 3 days. Everything was designed to be beautiful, flawless, and untouchable. Cressida, or Cress as she preferred, often felt like just another one of those exquisite, fragile objects. Her husband, Lucius Montclair, was the architect of this world. He was the charismatic, razor-sharp CEO of Montclair Couture, an empire built on the dazzling, cutthroat world of high fashion. To the public, he was a visionary. To his board, a titan. To Cress, he was the man who had swept her off her feet, a whirlwind of ambition and charm, who saw her a young, promising textile designer and decided she would be his. Their meeting had been a fairy tale. She was interning at a small artisanal fabric mill when he'd come scouting for new materials. He was captivated not by her designs, which he called charming but provincial, but by her quiet grace and the way she seemed to complement his own dazzling persona. He pursued her with the same relentless focus he applied to a corporate acquisition. Within 6 months, they were married. Cress, swept away by the grandeur and the intensity of his affection, believed she was the luckiest woman alive. She soon learned, however, that being Mrs. Montclair meant her own ambitions were expected to be packed away like last season's collection. Her design sketchbook, once filled with vibrant, innovative patterns, gathered dust on a shelf in her cavernous walk-in closet. When she tried to show him her work, he would pat her hand indulgently. "That's lovely, my dear," he'd say, his eyes already on his phone. "But you have a much more important role now. You're the face of my home, the hostess of my parties. Leave the hard work to me." The penthouse, for all its beauty, became her gilded cage. Her days were a structured sequence of appointments, with event planners, nutritionists, and personal trainers, all meticulously scheduled by Lucius's assistant. Her friends were Lucius's friends, wives of bankers and executives, who spoke of charity galas and summering in the Hamptons, their conversations as sterile and polished as the marble floors beneath their feet. Cress felt a part of herself, the creative, passionate part, slowly suffocating. The news of her pregnancy should have been a joyous occasion, a fresh start. When she told Lucius, placing the positive test on his polished mahogany desk, he looked up from a quarterly report, his expression unreadable. He didn't smile. He simply nodded slowly. "Good," he said, as if she had just successfully closed a deal. "A son, I hope. An heir is good for the brand's image. Legacy." His reaction was a cold splash of water, but Cress tried to rationalize it. He was a busy man, always thinking about the business. She threw herself into the pregnancy, hoping the shared experience of creating a life would bridge the growing chasm between them. She started sketching again this time, designs for baby clothes using soft organic fabrics. She imagined a small independent line, something of her own. One evening, brimming with a rare surge of confidence, she laid out her sketches and business proposal on the dining room table before he got home. She had worked on it for weeks, researching suppliers, costing out materials, and even creating a brand name, Bishop's Weave, a nod to her family name and her grandfather who had been a tailor. Lucius walked in, loosening his tie, his face tight with the stress of the day. He glanced at the papers scattered across the table, and his lip curled into a faint sneer. "What's all this? It's my idea," Cress began, her voice trembling slightly. "A luxury baby clothing line. The market is strong, and I have a unique perspective on sustainable fabrics." He picked up a sketch of a tiny, hand-stitched romper. He held it for a moment before letting it drop back onto the table. "Cressida, we've discussed this. Your hobby is charming, but it's not a business. Montclair Couture deals in power and desire, not baby clothes. It would dilute the brand." "It wouldn't be part of Montclair Couture," she insisted, her heart sinking. "It would be mine, something I built." He laughed, then a short, sharp sound devoid of humor. "Built, darling, you have no idea what it takes to build something. You live in a world I built for you. Your job is to be here, to be beautiful, and soon to be a mother. That should be enough for you. Now let's clear this away. We have the Future of Fashion Gala tomorrow night, and I need you to look rested." The finality in his tone was absolute. He didn't see her. He saw a function, a role to be played. The dismissal of her dream of her very identity, beyond being his wife, was more painful than any overt act of cruelty. As she gathered her sketches, her hands shaking, she felt the first true deep crack appear in the flawless facade of her life. The cage was no longer gilded. It was just a cage, and for the first time, she was rattling the bars, wondering if she had the strength to break them. The gala, meant to be a celebration of his success, now loomed like a final judgment on her own life's failures. The Future of Fashion Gala was the crown jewel of the city's social calendar, and Lucius Montclair was its undisputed king. The ballroom of the Grand Astoria Hotel was a sea of glittering gowns and tailored tuxedos. Waiters weaved through the throngs with trays of shimmering champagne, and the air hummed with the electric buzz of power money and influence. Cress felt a familiar sense of detachment as she stood by Lucius's side, a practiced smile fixed on her face. She wore a deep emerald gown of Montclair silk, a dress chosen for her, designed to perfectly accommodate her 5-month baby bump, while still exuding effortless elegance. To the outside world, she was the picture of a serene, glowing mother-to-be, the perfect consort to the man of the hour. Inside, she felt like a ghost haunting her own life. Lucius's dismissal of her business idea the night before had left a hollow ache in her chest that no amount of couture could cover. Lucius was in his element, holding court, his hand resting possessively on the small of her back. He accepted congratulations, his laughter booming his charisma, a tangible force field. But his eyes kept darting across the room, a flicker of something she couldn't quite place, anticipation, perhaps in their depths. Lucius, darling, a triumph as always, a gushing socialite, air-kissed them both. We do what we can, Brenda, Lucius replied with a practiced, self-deprecating charm. But the real future of this house is standing right over there. He gestured towards the stage, where a willowy woman with fire-red hair and a predatory smile was speaking to a cluster of fashion journalists. This was Giselle Dubois, Montclair Couture's new head designer, poached from a rival Parisian house with an astronomical salary. She was Lucius's latest, most celebrated acquisition, hailed as a design prodigy who would propel the brand into the stratosphere. Cress had met Giselle only once, a brief, chilly introduction, where the designer's eyes had swept over Cress with a look of utter disinterest, as if she were a piece of outdated furniture. Now, watching her command the room, Cress felt a prickle of unease. I need to go speak with the press, darling, Lucius said, squeezing her arm. Mingle. Look radiant. He left her side, and she felt instantly adrift. She made her way through the crowd, nodding and smiling, her mind 1,000,000 miles away. She found a quiet alcove near a balcony, seeking a moment of respite. The cool night air was a relief. From her vantage point, she could see most of the ballroom. She saw Lucius make his way over to Giselle. He didn't join the press circle. Instead, he drew Giselle away towards a shadowed corridor behind a large floral arrangement. Cress's unease sharpened into a cold dread. She told herself she was being paranoid hormonal, but she couldn't shake the feeling. Driven by an instinct she couldn't explain, she slipped out of the alcove and moved towards the corridor, keeping to the edges of the room. The thumping bass of the music masked her footsteps. As she neared the floral display, she could hear their voices low and intimate. The collection is a masterpiece, but you, my dear, are the true work of art. Lucius was saying, his voice a low purr she hadn't heard him use with her in years. And you are the patron who knows how to display it. Giselle's throaty laugh replied, Is your lovely little incubator enjoying the party? The casual cruelty of the word incubator struck Cress with the force of a physical blow. She felt the air leave her lungs. She plays her part, Lucius said dismissively. She's content. As long as she has her charities and her nesting instincts, she's perfectly manageable. Cress peeked through a gap in the orchids. She saw Lucius's hand slide from Giselle's waist to cup her face. He leaned in and kissed her, not a peck on the cheek, but a deep, lingering kiss, filled with a passion Cress had only ever dreamed of. Time seemed to stop. The music, the chatter, the clinking of glasses, it all faded into a dull roar. In that moment, Cress's world, already cracked, shattered into 1,000,000 irreparable pieces. It wasn't just infidelity. It was the complete and utter negation of her existence. She was a part, a manageable incubator. Her love, her pregnancy, their life together, it was all a sham, a carefully managed piece of brand strategy. She stumbled back, knocking a waiter's tray. A single champagne flute teetered and then fell shattering on the marble floor with a sound that seemed to echo the breaking of her own heart. The sound made them both turn. Lucius's eyes widened not with guilt or remorse, but with pure, unadulterated annoyance. He strode out of the corridor, Giselle a smug shadow behind him. "Cressida," he said, his voice dangerously low, his eyes cold as ice. "What are you doing, skulking in the corners?" Tears streamed down her face, hot and silent. "I saw you, Lucius." He glanced at the onlookers who were beginning to stare, his face hardening into a mask of public control. He grabbed her arm, his fingers digging into her skin, and steered her towards a side exit. "Don't you dare make a scene here," he hissed, his voice a venomous whisper in her ear. "You will ruin everything." "You ruined everything." She finally choked out the words, raw and ragged. "Our marriage, our baby." They were in a deserted hallway now. He finally let her go, pushing her against the wall. He looked at her, then truly looked at her, and she saw nothing but contempt. "Our baby," he scoffed. "Don't be so dramatic. It's a convenient distraction for you, isn't it? Something to keep you busy. You should focus on your little hobby. You know the baby." The words from the opening hook, the final fatal blow. He had taken the one pure, precious thing in her life, their unborn child, and twisted it into another insult, another way to diminish her. Something inside Cress snapped. The grief, the shock, the years of quiet subservience, it all coalesced into a single clarifying moment of cold, hard certainty. She looked him dead in the eye, her tears suddenly gone, replaced by an unnerving calm. "You're right," she said, her voice steady. "I should focus, but not on the baby, on getting as far away from you as I possibly can." Before he could react, she turned and walked away. Not back to the party, but down the hall past the kitchens and out a service exit into the cold night air. The city lights blurred as she walked a taxi's headlights, cutting through the darkness. She didn't look back. She left behind the diamonds, the silk gown, the penthouse, the lies. She walked out with nothing but the clothes on her back, a life growing inside her, and the chilling echo of her husband's final unforgivable words. The shattering was complete. Now all that was left were the ruins. The cold night air hit Cress like a slap, a brutal awakening from the suffocating warmth of the gala. The emerald silk gown felt like a costume from another life, thin and useless against the city's unforgiving chill. Her manicured hands, accustomed to the soft leather of a chauffeured car, fumbled in her tiny clutch. She had her phone, a lipstick, and a single credit card, a supplementary card on Lucius's account, which she knew would be cancelled by morning. Panic, cold and sharp, threatened to overwhelm her. She was pregnant alone and effectively homeless on a downtown street corner. The towering skyscrapers that once represented a life of luxury now seemed to mock her, their glittering facades cold and indifferent. For a terrifying moment, she had nowhere to go. Her parents were gone, and the friends she'd cultivated over the past few years were Lucius's allies, their loyalty bought and paid for by his influence. Then a memory surfaced, a beacon in the storm. Mrs. Peterson. Martha Peterson was her landlady from college, a kind, no-nonsense widow who rented out rooms in her modest but impeccably kept brownstone in a quiet, older part of the city. Cress had kept in touch, sending a Christmas card every year, a small link to a life that was truly her own. With trembling fingers, she found the number and called. "Cressida? Dear, is that you? It's past midnight. Is everything all right?" Mrs. Peterson's voice was warm but laced with concern. A sob escaped Cress's lips, the first sound she'd made since leaving the hotel. "No," she whispered the word, cracking. "Nothing is all right. Can I come over? I have nowhere else to go." There was no hesitation. "Of course, dear. The kettle's always on. Come home." Home. The word was a balm to her shattered soul. A taxi ride across the city felt like a journey across worlds. She left the sleek, modern steel and glass of Lucius's district and entered a neighborhood of brick buildings, fire escapes and laundromats that glowed warmly in the dark. Mrs. Peterson opened the door before Cress even knocked. She was a small, sturdy woman with kind eyes and hair the color of steel wool. She took one look at Cress's tear-streaked face and the ridiculously opulent gown and simply opened her arms. Cress collapsed into her embrace, the raw, unfiltered grief she'd been suppressing, finally erupting in a storm of sobs. Mrs. Peterson led her inside, sat her down at the worn oak kitchen table, and wrapped a thick knitted afghan around her shoulders. She placed a steaming mug of chamomile tea in Cress's hands and sat opposite her, waiting patiently for the storm to pass. Over the next hour, the whole sordid story came pouring out, the dismissiveness, the affair with Giselle, the final cruel words about the baby. Mrs. Peterson listened without judgment, her expression a mixture of sorrow and a quiet, simmering anger on Cress's behalf. "That man," she said, finally, her voice firm, "is a fool of the highest order. To throw away a diamond because he's too busy admiring cheap glass." That night, Cress slept in the small attic room she had rented as a student, the scent of lavender and old books a comforting lullaby. The mattress was lumpy. The sheets were faded cotton, not Egyptian, but for the first time in years, she felt safe. The next few weeks were a brutal adjustment. The first thing she did was take the taxi to a consignment shop and sell the emerald gown and the diamond earrings she was wearing. The money was a pittance compared to their worth, but it was hers. It was enough for a few weeks' rent to Mrs. Peterson, who initially refused, but relented when Cress insisted a simple wardrobe of second-hand clothes and groceries. The whiplash of her new reality was staggering. One day she was attending fittings for custom maternity wear. The next she was counting change to see if she could afford organic milk. The nausea of her first trimester returned with a vengeance amplified by stress and a diet that no longer included chef-prepared, nutrient-balanced meals. She was exhausted emotionally and physically. Some days the weight of her grief and fear was so heavy she could barely get out of bed. She would lie there, one hand on her growing belly, and weep for the future she had lost and for the child who would be born into this chaos. Lucius made no attempt to contact her. The credit card was cancelled within hours, as she'd predicted. A week later, a curt email from his lawyer arrived informing her that divorce proceedings had been initiated and that given the circumstances of her desertion, she should not expect a generous settlement. There was no mention of the baby. It was as if she and their child had been surgically excised from his life. The cold corporate cruelty of it all reignited a spark of anger within her. It was a small spark, but in the darkness of her despair, it was enough to see by. Mrs. Peterson was her rock. She would leave trays of toast and soup outside Cress's door, never pushing, but always present. She'd coax her out for walks in the local park, encouraging her to feel the sun on her face. "One foot in front of the other, dear," she'd say. "That's all anyone can do." Slowly, painfully, Cress began to piece herself back together. The storm was still raging, but she was no longer adrift. She was learning to build a raft. She started sketching again, not for a business, but for herself. She drew the faces she saw in the park, the intricate patterns of leaves on the sidewalk, the way the light hit the brick buildings at sunset. It was a way to reclaim a part of herself that Lucius had tried to extinguish. She was no longer Cressida Montclair, the millionaire's wife. She was Cress Bishop, a designer, a survivor, and a mother-to-be. And in the quiet anonymity of her new life that felt like a promotion, months bled into one another. The city transitioned from the crispness of late autumn to the deep freeze of winter. Cress's belly grew round and full, a constant living reminder of the new life she was now solely responsible for. The sharp, acute pain of Lucius's betrayal had dulled into a persistent heavy ache, but her focus had shifted. Her survival and the well-being of her baby became her entire world. She found a quiet rhythm in her life with Mrs. Peterson. She helped with chores around the house. Her sketches began to fill a new portfolio, and she even took on some small freelance jobs designing logos and brochures for local businesses. The pay was meager, but the sense of accomplishment was immeasurable. Each dollar she earned was a brick in the foundation of her new independent life. One particularly cold and snowy afternoon, with the city hushed under a blanket of white, Mrs. Peterson asked for her help clearing out some old boxes from a storage closet. "My old bones aren't what they used to be," she said with a smile. Amongst the dusty relics of a life well lived, Cress found a small wooden trunk tucked away in a corner. It was hers. Her mother had sent it to Mrs. Peterson for safekeeping when Cress had first moved in with Lucius, filled with childhood mementos and things that didn't fit into the sterile minimalism of the penthouse. She had completely forgotten about it. Curious, she pried open the lid. Inside were photo albums, her old art school projects, and a collection of her grandfather's things. Robert Bishop had been a master tailor, a quiet, meticulous man who had passed away when Cress was in her late teens. He had been her first mentor, the one who taught her about the feel of different fabrics, the importance of a perfect stitch, the soul that could be woven into a garment. She lifted out his old sewing kit, the heavy shears he used to cut cloth, and a small velvet pouch. Inside the pouch was not jewelry, but a single ornate old-fashioned brass key and a thick sealed envelope made of heavy parchment. Her name, Cressida, was written on the front in her grandfather's elegant looping script. Her heart pounded as she broke the wax seal. The letter inside was dated a week before he passed away. "My dearest Cressida, if you are reading this, it means I am gone, and I hope that you have found happiness in your life. I am writing to you about a part of my past I rarely spoke of. Long before I was a simple neighborhood tailor, I was a partner in a business. I was the craftsman, the artist. My partner was the salesman, the visionary. Together we founded a small but exceptional textile company called Ariadne Weavers. We created fabrics of unparalleled quality. Over time, my partner, a man named Jonathan Montclair, wanted to expand into fashion, into a world of glamour and branding that held little appeal for me. We had different visions. I wanted to create art. He wanted to build an empire. We parted ways amicably. I sold him my operational shares, but I kept my founding stake, a silent, controlling interest in the parent company we had established. I had no interest in boardrooms or stock markets, but I wanted to ensure the legacy of our quality was protected. I put these shares into a blind trust for you, my only grandchild. The company evolved, and Ariadne Weavers became the foundation of what you now likely know as Montclair Couture. Jonathan's son, and perhaps his grandson, may have forgotten that the roots of their grand empire lie in the hands of a quiet tailor. This key will open a safe deposit box at the Sterling National Bank downtown. Inside you will find the trust documents. They are structured to give you full control upon your 30th birthday, or under a force majeure clause, which can be enacted in the event of significant personal distress or upheaval. My lawyer, a brilliant man named David Chen, holds the second key and the full instructions. His card is enclosed. This is your legacy, Cressida. Not a weapon, but a shield. It is the fruit of my life's work. Use it to protect yourself, to build something beautiful and true, and to ensure that true craftsmanship is never sacrificed for the sake of empty glamour. Be happy, my dear girl. With all my love. Grandfather Robert Cress read the letter 3 times, her hands shaking so violently the parchment rattled. Montclair Couture, Lucius's company. Her grandfather was the silent founder. It seemed impossible a fantasy. She stared at the heavy brass key in her palm. It felt impossibly real. A shield, he had called it. Right now, she needed a shield more than anything. The next morning, driven by a dizzying mix of hope and disbelief, she called the number on the enclosed business card. A calm, professional voice answered. Law offices of Chen and Associates. My name is Cressida Bishop, she said, her own voice barely a whisper. I was told to contact a Mr. David Chen. It's regarding my grandfather, Robert Bishop. There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. Mr. Chen has been expecting your call for a very long time, the voice replied. Can you come in this afternoon? The law office was in a sleek, modern building, a world away from Mrs. Peterson's cozy brownstone. But Cress walked in not as a supplicant, but as a woman on a mission. David Chen was a sharp, impeccably dressed man in his late 50s, with intelligent eyes that seemed to see everything. He greeted her not with pity, but with a deep professional respect. He already had his key. Together they went to the bank. The safe deposit box was opened, and inside, nestled in a leather-bound folio, were the documents. As Mr. Chen explained the complex legal language, the reality of the situation began to sink in. Her grandfather hadn't just left her some stock. He had left her a 52% controlling interest in the holding company that owned Montclair Couture and all its assets. It was an ironclad, unassailable majority stake. Because Lucius's father had diluted his own shares over the years to fund acquisitions and pay off debts, Lucius's own portion, which he believed gave him ultimate control, was only around 35%. He was a king ruling a kingdom he didn't actually own. Your grandfather's force majeure clause is quite clear. Mr. Chen explained, his voice calm and steady, as he looked at the heavily pregnant, determined woman before him. Your current circumstances, divorce, financial abandonment, more than satisfy the conditions. The trust is now yours to command. The question is, Ms. Bishop, what do you want to do with it? Cress looked down at the documents at her grandfather's name, entwined with the Montclairs. She thought of Lucius's sneering face, of Giselle's cruel nickname for her, of the way her dreams had been casually crushed. But more than that, she thought of her grandfather's words, build something beautiful and true. A slow, determined smile spread across her face. The storm hadn't broken her. It had washed away the debris and revealed the foundation that had been there all along. Mr. Chen, she said, her voice clear and strong. I want to call a meeting. an extraordinary general meeting of the shareholders, and I want to introduce them to their new majority owner. The discovery of her inheritance didn't trigger an immediate, vengeful charge. Instead, it ignited a slow, deliberate fire within Cress. The months of helplessness and fear were burned away, replaced by a cold, crystalline focus. She was no longer a victim adrift in a storm. She was the storm itself, gathering strength, waiting for the perfect moment to make landfall. David Chen became her general, her strategist. They met not in his gleaming corporate office, but in the quiet, sunlit parlor of Mrs. Peterson's brownstone, a war room hidden in plain sight. Over cups of tea and plates of biscuits, they pored over decades of company financials, board meeting minutes, and shareholder reports. Cress wasn't just claiming an inheritance. She was earning it. She devoured every document, learning the intricate dance of corporate governance, finance, and law. She discovered the company's weaknesses, its strengths, and most importantly, the rot that had set in under Lucius's leadership. While Montclair Couture's public image was stronger than ever, thanks to Giselle's flashy, critically acclaimed but astronomically expensive new collection, the company's finances told a different story. Lucius was leveraging assets to fund lavish marketing campaigns and his own exorbitant lifestyle. He had fired dozens of long-serving loyal employees, master tailors, pattern makers, and textile experts who had been with the company for decades, some since her grandfather's era, replacing them with cheaper, less experienced labor to cut costs. He was sacrificing the very soul of the company, its commitment to quality craftsmanship, for short-term buzz and profit. He was turning her grandfather's legacy into a hollow, gilded shell. "He's arrogant," David Chen observed one afternoon, tapping a finger on a damning quarterly report. "He believes he's untouchable. That's our greatest advantage. He won't see us coming." Their plan, which Cress privately named the Phoenix Agenda, was twofold. First, they needed to consolidate her power silently. While her 52% stake gave her control, David advised acquiring a few more percentage points on the open market through a proxy buyer. This would not only fortify her position, but also create a small stir, a tremor that might put Lucius on edge, but wouldn't reveal the true source of the earthquake to come. "We make him look for a threat from a rival corporation or a hedge fund," David explained. "He'll be looking in the wrong direction, scanning the horizon for battleships, while our submarine glides right underneath him." Second, Cress needed to be ready. It wasn't enough to be the owner. She had to be the leader. She spent her days studying and her nights sketching. But now her designs weren't for a quaint baby line. They were for a new Montclair Couture, a collection that honored her grandfather's commitment to fabric and form, but was infused with a bold, modern vision. It was a vision of strength, resilience, and quiet power. Everything she herself was becoming. As her due date approached, her resolve only hardened. The kicks and flutters in her womb were a constant reminder of what she was fighting for, not just for herself, but for her child's future, a future free from the shadow of a man like Lucius Montclair. Meanwhile, Lucius remained blissfully, arrogantly unaware. Cress's quiet disappearance from his life was to him a problem solved. He was seen at every party, every opening, with the triumphant Giselle Dubois on his arm. The press hailed them as the new power couple of fashion. In a widely circulated interview, Lucius was asked about his recent divorce. "Sometimes people grow in different directions," he'd said with a dismissive wave of his hand. "My focus has always been, and will always be, on the future of this company. I require a partner who shares that vision, not one who is distracted by domestic trivialities." The words relayed to Cress by David were like fuel on the fire. Domestic trivialities. He was talking about their child. A week before the annual shareholders' meeting, Cress gave birth to a healthy baby girl. She named her Grace. Holding her daughter in her arms in the quiet hospital room, looking into her tiny, perfect face, Cress knew every fear, every tear, every moment of struggle had been worth it. This was not just about taking back a company. It was about reclaiming her life and building a legacy of strength for her daughter. The day of the shareholders' meeting arrived a cool, crisp morning 6 weeks after Grace was born. Lucius was expecting a routine victory lap. The press was already lauding his incredible turnaround of the brand. He had prepared a triumphant speech about record-breaking sales from Giselle's latest collection and his bold vision for the future. Cress, however, was preparing for battle. She left Grace in the loving care of Mrs. Peterson. She didn't dress in a flashy, attention-grabbing gown. Instead, she chose a custom-tailored suit of her own design, made from a deep charcoal grey wool that her grandfather would have admired. It was elegant, powerful, and understated. Her hair was pulled back in a severe professional chignon, and her face, though tired from sleepless nights with a newborn, was set with a resolve of forged steel. As David Chen held the door of the car for her, outside the corporate tower that bore the Montclair name, he gave her a final reassuring nod. "Ready, Ms. Bishop?" She took a deep breath, the city air cool and clean. She thought of her grandfather's letter of her daughter, sleeping peacefully in her crib. She was no longer the broken, weeping woman who had fled into the night. She was a phoenix, risen from the ashes, and she was about to claim her sky. "I'm ready," she said, her voice ringing with a clarity and power that was entirely her own. The Montclair Couture boardroom was on the 50th floor, a glass-walled sanctuary of power overlooking the sprawling city. It was designed to intimidate with a long, imposing table of polished black granite and chairs that resembled minimalist thrones. The shareholders and board members, a collection of stern-faced men and women in expensive suits, were already assembled. At the head of the table sat Lucius Montclair, radiating an aura of absolute command. He was tanned, smiling the very picture of a man at the apex of his success. Beside him, in a seat of honor, usually reserved for the COO, was Giselle Dubois, looking smug and victorious in a shockingly red dress. She was not a board member, but her presence was a clear statement of her power and influence within Lucius's new world order. "As you can see from the preliminary reports," Lucius began, his voice smooth and confident, "Giselle's Metamorphosis collection has not only garnered universal acclaim, but has also driven sales up by 200% this quarter. Our stock price is at an all-time high. The future of Montclair Couture has never been brighter." He launched into a self-congratulatory speech filled with buzzwords like synergy, disruption, and brand actualization. He painted a picture of a future built on his singular, brilliant vision. The board members nodded along their expressions, ranging from impressed to sycophantic. It was at that moment, just as Lucius was pausing for dramatic effect, that the boardroom doors opened. Every head turned. Standing in the doorway was a woman they didn't recognize. She was flanked by the formidable David Chen, whose reputation as one of the city's sharpest corporate lawyers preceded him. The woman was poised, her expression unreadable, her tailored grey suit a stark contrast to Giselle's flamboyant red. She radiated an aura of quiet, unshakable authority. Lucius frowned, irritated by the interruption. I'm sorry, this is a private meeting. Security. But before anyone could move, David Chen stepped forward, placing a slim leather portfolio on the granite table. That won't be necessary, Mr. Montclair. We are precisely where we are supposed to be. Cress stepped into the room, her heels clicking with quiet purpose on the marble floor. Her eyes swept across the room, lingering for a fraction of a second on Giselle's confused sneer, before finally landing on Lucius. Lucius stared at her. Recognition dawned, slowly contorting his features into a mask of pure disbelief. This was Cressida, but it wasn't. The timid, accommodating woman he had discarded was gone. This woman was a stranger, powerful, confident, and looking at him not with heartbreak, but with an unnervingly calm detachment like a scientist observing a specimen. Cressida. He finally stammered, his voice losing its confident timbre. What in God's name are you doing here? My name, she said, her voice clear and steady, filling the suddenly silent room, is Miss Bishop, and I am here to attend my first shareholders' meeting. A confused murmur rippled through the room. Shareholder, one of the board members scoffed. With all due respect, the shares held by employees and minor investors don't grant access to this meeting. David Chen opened his portfolio. Ms. Bishop is not a minor investor, he stated calmly, sliding official notarized documents across the table towards the board's chairman. She is the sole beneficiary of the Robert Bishop Blind Trust. As of 2 months ago, she has taken active control of that trust. The chairman, a portly man named George Finney, picked up the documents, his eyes widening as he read. The Bishop Trust, but that's been dormant for decades. It's a founding stake. His voice trailed off as the implication hit him. He looked up, his face pale. To be precise, David Chen continued, the trust holds 52% of the voting shares of the parent company, Montclair Holdings International. My client, Ms. Cressida Bishop, is the new majority owner. The silence that followed was absolute, a crushing weight of pure shock. You could have heard a pin drop. Giselle's smug expression had vanished, replaced by a slack-jawed horror. The board members stared first at the documents, then at Cress, their minds scrambling to process the impossible truth. Lucius's face had drained of all color. He looked as if he'd been physically struck. That's impossible, he breathed, shaking his head. It's a lie. My father, your father knew. Cress said, her voice cutting through his denial like a shard of glass. He knew that the foundation of this entire empire belonged to my grandfather, the man whose artistry he built his brand upon, and then conveniently forgot. You, however, seem to have been kept in the dark. She walked slowly around the table until she stood directly opposite him. You spoke of your vision for the future, she said, her gaze unwavering. But your vision is one of debt disposability and disrespect for the legacy that made this company great. You fired craftsmen who had dedicated their lives to this house to fund her overpriced, overhyped collections. She gave a curt nod towards a horrified Giselle. You leveraged the company's assets to fund your own ego. You have mistaken flash for substance and buzz for value. She placed her hands on the back of the chair at the head of the table. Effective immediately, I am exercising my rights as majority shareholder. This board is adjourned. A new meeting will be called tomorrow to elect a new board of directors. Mr. Montclair, your position as CEO and chairman is terminated. You have 1 hour to clear your personal belongings from your office. Security will escort you out. Lucius just stared at her, speechless, his empire crumbling around him in the space of 5 minutes. You can't do this, he finally whispered, his voice cracking. cracking with desperation and rage. Cress leaned forward slightly, her voice dropping to a low, intense pitch for his ears alone. "You once told me to focus on my little hobby. You were right. I found one. It's called owning your entire world. You said a son would be good for the brand's legacy. You were wrong. A daughter is." With that, she straightened up and addressed the stunned room. "My name is Cressida Bishop, and I am the future of this company." The silence in the boardroom stretched for a full 10 seconds, a vacuum of pure shock that sucked all the air from the room. Then it fractured. Lucius Montclair, who had stood frozen as if turned to stone, finally came back to life, but as a grotesque parody of his former self. The charismatic control vanished, replaced by a raw, sputtering rage. "Fraud!" he roared, his voice cracking. He slammed his fist on the black granite table, a gesture that lacked its intended power and only betrayed his desperation. "This is a fabrication, a pathetic, vengeful fantasy. My lawyers will bury you. You have no idea who you're dealing with." Cress didn't flinch. She stood her ground, a pillar of calm in his storm. "On the contrary, Lucius," she replied, her voice level and cold. "You are the one who has no idea. You never did. You saw a quiet wife, not a founder's heir. You saw a hobby, not a legacy. Your blindness is not my problem." Her composure seemed to enrage him further. He turned his pleading, wild eyes to the board members, the men and women who had idolized him just minutes before. "Finney, tell her this is absurd. We are Montclair Couture. George Finney." The chairman meticulously avoided Lucius's gaze. His attention suddenly glued to the documents in his hands, as if they were the most fascinating text he had ever read. The other board members followed suit, shuffling papers, checking their phones, doing anything to avoid being caught in the blast radius of their fallen leader. They were sharks, and they could smell the blood in the water. Their allegiance had already shifted their minds furiously, calculating how to best position themselves in this new regime. Seeing no help there, Lucius's fury collapsed into a pathetic, desperate plea. "Cressida, Cress, please," he whispered, the change in tone jarring. "We can talk about this. There's been a misunderstanding. We can work something out, a settlement." It was the sight of Giselle that cut him short. Her face, a mask of horror, was twisted with a fury that mirrored his own. But her anger was aimed at him, the man whose power had been her shield and her platform. With a strangled cry of disgust, she shot Cress a look of pure, unadulterated hatred, grabbed her ludicrously expensive handbag, and fled. Her stiletto heels clicked a frantic, panicked rhythm on the marble floor, the sound of an era of cheap spectacle running for its life. Her exit seemed to be the final nail in the coffin. Lucius deflated the fight, draining out of him, leaving a slumped, hollowed-out man. His shoulders sagged, and for the first time he looked his age. The two security guards who entered the room were almost a mercy, their impassive presence putting an end to the humiliating spectacle. They flanked him, their quiet professionalism, a stark contrast to his emotional disintegration. As they led him toward the door, he finally looked at Cress one last time, his eyes searching for something. Pity, regret, a flicker of the woman he once knew. He found nothing but the cool, steady gaze of a stranger who now owned his entire world. The heavy doors clicked shut behind him, the sound echoing with a profound finality. The reign of Lucius Montclair was over. The boardroom was still thick with tension. Cress allowed the silence to hang in the air for a moment, letting the new reality cement itself in the minds of everyone present. Then she turned to the pale-faced chairman. "Mr. Finney," she said, her voice crisp and authoritative. "Please schedule the extraordinary meeting for 9 a.m. tomorrow. My office will forward you the agenda and the list of my proposed new board members. You are all welcome to tender your resignations beforehand if you feel you cannot align with the new direction of this company." It was a clear, professional dismissal. David Chen gave a slight, satisfied nod, gathering his papers. As the shaken board members filed out, avoiding her eyes, he placed a steadying hand on her arm. "You were magnificent, Ms. Bishop." Cress let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. The adrenaline began to recede, leaving a profound, bone-deep sense of exhaustion and a startlingly clear sense of purpose. "This was just the first step, David," she said. "The real work starts now." Her first day as chairwoman of Montclair Holdings was a blur of calculated action, but she didn't begin in the executive suite. She bypassed the elevators and took the service stairs down to the workshops, the true heart of the company. When she entered, a hush fell over the room. The remaining artisans, the cutters, seamstresses, and textile experts looked up from their work, their faces etched with the anxious uncertainty of people who had grown used to the axe falling without warning. She gathered them together, standing not on a platform, but among them on the worn wooden floor. "My name is Cressida Bishop," she began, her voice resonating with warmth and sincerity. "Some of you may have known my grandfather, Robert Bishop." A few of the older workers exchanged surprised glances. An elderly tailor at the back, a man with hands gnarled from 60 years of holding a needle, let out a soft gasp. He remembered. "My grandfather believed that a garment's soul is in its fabric and its stitch." Cress continued, her gaze sweeping over their faces. "He believed in substance, in quality, in the irreplaceable value of a master's hand. This company was built on that belief, and under my leadership we are returning to it." She then announced her first executive order, the immediate reinstatement of every single craftsman Lucius had fired, with full back pay and a formal apology from the company. A wave of stunned disbelief was followed by a ripple of applause that grew into a heartfelt ovation. The old tailor, his eyes glistening with tears, stepped forward. "Robert Bishop," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "was the finest man I ever knew. He would be so proud of you today, miss." In that moment, Cress wasn't just a CEO. She was a promise fulfilled, a legacy restored. Over the next few weeks, the transformation of Montclair Couture was seismic. Cress's Phoenix agenda was not just about a hostile takeover. It was a complete cultural and creative resurrection. The new motto she installed, etched onto the lobby wall, where a giant portrait of Lucius used to hang, was substance over spectacle. She walked through the design studio, which felt sterile and soulless under Giselle's tenure. Tucked away in a corner, she found Helen, a veteran pattern maker in her late 60s, who was quietly packing her things, assuming she would be next to go. Cress approached her and asked to see her personal sketchbook. Hesitantly, Helen revealed pages filled with designs of breathtaking elegance and structural genius ideas Lucius and Giselle had dismissed as too classic. "Helen," Cress said, her voice gentle but firm, "I'm not accepting your resignation. I'm offering you the position of head designer." The woman stared at her, speechless, as Cress explained her new vision, a company led by the talent that had been its bedrock all along. The most symbolic change was the C-suite itself. Lucius's office had been a monument to his ego, all black marble chrome and oversized modern art with a desk the size of a small car. Cress had it all stripped out. The dark walls were painted a warm, inviting white. Sunlight, once blocked by imposing blinds, was allowed to flood the space. In place of the massive desk, she brought in a large communal work table covered in fabric swatches and sketchbooks, and in the sunniest corner, she placed a beautiful handcrafted bassinet. Her daughter Grace would often sleep there as Cress worked a living, breathing symbol of the company's new life, a future that was female, nurturing, and creative at its core. One evening, months after the takeover, Cress stood at the vast window of that transformed office, holding a sleeping Grace in her arms. The city lights glittered below, no longer mocking her, but spread out before her like a kingdom of her own making. She thought of the woman she had been, the heartbroken wife, fleeing a party in a borrowed gown, the terrified mother-to-be huddled in Mrs. Peterson's attic room. She thought of the weight of her grandfather's key in her palm, the key that had unlocked not just a fortune, but the strength that had been inside her all along. The world was calling her story a tale of revenge. But as she looked down at her daughter's peaceful face, she knew it was something more profound. Revenge was a fire that consumed itself, leaving only ash. What she had done was an act of restoration. She had saved a legacy from ruin and built a future for her child. She was no longer a prisoner in a gilded cage. She was the architect of her own destiny, a creator, a leader, and a mother. She had walked out of her old life broken, but in doing so had discovered the parts of herself that were truly unbreakable. Her reign, the reign of a bishop, had only just begun. And there you have it, the incredible story of Cressida Bishop, a story that proves that the deepest betrayals can sometimes forge the strongest souls. She went from a broken, pregnant wife with nothing to her name to the powerful leader of a fashion empire, not through revenge, but through resilience, intelligence, and by reclaiming a legacy she never knew she had. Her journey reminds us that our true strength often lies dormant, hidden in our history, and in our character, just waiting for a crisis to awaken it. It's a powerful lesson that sometimes losing everything is the only way to truly find yourself and build something even more magnificent in its place. What did you think of Cress's ultimate power move? Was Lucius's downfall everything you hoped it would be? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If you were moved by this story of strength and poetic justice, please hit that like button. Share it with someone who needs to hear a story of triumph, and most importantly, subscribe to our channel for more unforgettable real-life dramas. Your support helps us bring these powerful stories to light. Thank you for listening.